No, not if you came to my session yesterday about Docker Swarm, or if you read this slide right here, you'll know my opinion about APIs. I think that APIs are awesome. I'm not ashamed to say that I've called them superpowered magic Legos, because they're these magical little blocks that we can put into our application, and they give us the ability to do things that we wouldn't be able to do on our own. So it might be something like geocoding a zip code or an IP address. It might be something like payment processing. But the abilities that they give us, it never ceases to amaze me. So I love working with APIs. And it's a good thing because at this point it seems like everything has an API. Over the last 15 years, the growth of APIs has just gone through the roof. I think we all remember the Oprah episode where she gave everyone an API. But seriously, everything has an API. I could spend the rest of the session just reading a list of things that have APIs. I won't do that to you, but I'll share a link to these slides afterward. I've got a link to Todd Moto's list of public APIs here, and if you scroll down, it's just an endless list. Along with cats and dogs, we have goat APIs, anime, art, books, business, calendars, and we're only in the C's. From AI to natural language processing to Ron Swanson from Parks and Rec. There are APIs for pretty much everything you can imagine. APIs for sending physical mail. That blew my mind when I heard that. If you use DigitalOcean's API, you can spin up a VM, you can destroy a VM, you can create a firewall. The power that you have with these is amazing. As ColdFusion developers, we know that ColdFusion typically isn't one of the 1, 2, or 3 official API clients that these providers give. So that puts us in a position where we need to write our own wrappers so that we can use these awesome tools. API wrappers. So what exactly are we talking about when we say we're going to write an API wrapper? There's actually a number of different terms people use when they're referring to these things. SDKs, client SDKs, API libraries, API client library, SDK, wrapper, helpers. It's all the same thing. We're basically talking in ColdFusion about a component with functions that are going to map one-to-one to the endpoints of an API. So it maps to that endpoint, and that way you can encapsulate, you can wrap the functionality of the API within your ColdFusion component and use that within your application. One of the reasons we're going to use APIs is that we don't want to reinvent the wheel. There's a quote that I read that don't reinvent the wheel, the internet is full of wheels, and most of them have APIs. So these APIs, they give us the ability to do things so that we don't have to figure out payment processing, because someone way smarter than us has already done that. And it's at Stripe, and we can use what they've learned. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. And this idea of not reinventing the wheel and not doing unnecessary work is also going to be a theme throughout this presentation. So we want to get started. We found a really cool, awesome API that we want to use. What do we do? Well, step one, honestly, is don't write anything. There may be a ColdFusion wrapper out there for that API already. There's a good chance that there is. There's tons of places to look. Number one, ForgeBox. I think there's a little bit of a misconception. First of all, if you don't know about ForgeBox, it's a repository of ColdFusion code and projects that you can use in your own apps. Some people who are familiar with it think that it only has to do with ColdBox. I can tell you that that's not true because I don't use ColdBox, and I put all the projects that I write up on ForgeBox. So there's a ton of API-related items there. Take a look. A bunch of them are the ones that I was putting together while I was doing this. But you search APIs, there's wrappers for all sorts of things. What do we got here? We have the Marvel API by Matt Gifford. Shout out to Matt Clemente. You can also search GitHub. There's tons of APIs for things. So you want an API wrapper for the Star Wars API. You do a search for ColdFusion code on GitHub, and there's 2 Star Wars API wrappers. So we're ColdFusion developers, and we have options. Bottom line, don't write a wrapper if you don't need to. There might be one out there. Use the resources that the community has. Take advantage of that. Hop on the CFML Slack channel if you haven't joined that. Ask if someone's written a wrapper for the API. Use the ColdFusion portal, etc., etc. Don't reinvent the wheel. Don't do work that you don't have to do. That's actually, well, the way that I got here was, I don't know if you remember payment processing online 20 years ago, but it was the Wild West. So I was at a company and they were taking credit card information and emailing it to a bookkeeper who had her own QuickBooks install, and she was setting up subscriptions, and it was a mess. And eventually we convinced management that we wanted to switch to Stripe. John Bergquist has Stripe CFC, a ColdFusion wrapper for the Stripe API, and we used it, and everything was right with the world. It was a joy to use. It made our life so much easier and also more secure, functioning correctly. And I looked under the hood and I read the code for his wrapper for the Stripe API, and I was really impressed. It was really elegant, the way that he had it organized made a lot of sense to me, and it just stuck with me. So a couple years down the line, we're switching from AWS to Mailgun for our email, and there's not a ColdFusion wrapper. Let me try to take John's wrapper and I'll try to modify it a little bit and see if I can use it with Mailgun. It worked. And this pattern continued. So we switched from Mailgun to SendGrid, same thing, and then I just kind of got carried away and started writing tons of API wrappers because I love working with them. What I learned along the way is that obviously every API is different. We know that. But really, when you're writing wrappers, every API is the same. And the reason for this is basically REST and HTTP. HTTP is the protocol. REST is that architectural style for how the HTTP calls are made and the responses that come back. The APIs that we're working with, in 99% of the time, they're RESTful or they're REST-ish. They implement this pattern, and it makes it very easy to write a wrapper for it because it's always following the same pattern back and forth. Adam Tull, who is the author of Taffy, which is a ColdFusion REST framework, he wrote a book about REST, and the way that he described it is CRUD over HTTP. This is what our wrappers are going to be doing. They're going to be making create, retrieve, update, and delete requests over HTTP. That's what we're going to have to wrap. And there's some exceptions to this. There's some calls that don't quite follow that model, but that's the bulk of what we're doing. A familiarity with REST and those conventions is a great place to start when you're working on API wrappers. You want to make sure you have that foundational knowledge of RESTful principles, of HTTP. Adam's book, by the way, I highly recommend it. There's a link to it there at the bottom. If you want a primer on REST and those principles, it's practical, it's pragmatic, it's very real world. It's not like abstract and out there. It's a real developer talking about it. So that's totally recommend that if you want a primer on this. Now, you'll bear with me. I'm going to run through some basics of the HTTP request and response because this is the fundamentals of what we're going to be working on. There's 6 elements of an HTTP request that our wrapper is going to need to deal with. We've got the method, host path params, the headers, and the body. For the method, there's only 5 methods that our wrapper is going to end up needing to deal with. It's get, post, put, patch, and delete. In most cases, that's all you're going to have to do. When you're writing a wrapper, the host is going to end up being a constant. If you're sending calls to Stripe's API because you wrote a wrapper for that, every single request is going to be going to api.stripe.com. You can set that once and it's never going to change. In our definition of what an API wrapper is, we talked about how it's taking an API endpoint, that path, and it's mapping it to a function. So if you're writing a wrapper, you're going to have functions that map to almost all of the paths of the API. So to /images, /users, /cats, you'll have functions mapping to those paths. And then a lot of the work that you're actually doing in the API is going to be with the params, putting together query params, and with the body, usually assembling JSON. Touch on the headers. Headers are where content type negotiation takes place and also where authentication takes place. So maybe you're passing in basic auth or your API key. So we can going to account for headers in our API wrapper. The response from the API is going to be even simpler. We have a status code, we have status text, so 200, okay, everything's great. If you're not familiar with it, I've never seen it implemented in a while, but it's there in the RFC spec. Status code 418's status text is I'm a teapot. And that's real, you can check it out, and that's my absolute favorite. I think it was an April Fool's joke. The APIs also send headers back that we might want to look at. A lot of times APIs will include rate limiting info there or other helpful information for developers. And then finally, if we're asking for data, hopefully we're getting that data back in response as well. So this is what our wrappers will need to deal with. Those 6 elements of the request and these elements of the response. We're going to get started taking a look at the cat API. The cat API, which is obviously good for nothing except for demos. And as I found out while I was preparing for this, it's great for convincing your 4- and 6-year-old daughter that you have the coolest job in the world because you just sit there refreshing cat pictures. I want dad in the morning when they saw me working on this API. If we were going to do this manually, it would look something like this. We assemble our query params, we have our CF HTTP request, we put the method in there, get request, the API, we have the path, images, search, stick those query params on, make sure we include the headers for the content type, for the API key, because the cat API, you need an API key now, and our user agent response comes back and we deserialize it. This works, but it's not very flexible. It's certainly not a superpowered magic Lego that we can use. So we compare this to if we're using an API wrapper, and it would look something more like this. We create our wrapper object, we say, get me a random cat GIF, and then we write the output. By encapsulating the API, we can use this throughout our application, and it's just far easier to use. This is why we're writing wrappers for these APIs, so that we can harness the functionality like this in a simple way. When we're writing our wrappers, another note about not reinventing the wheel. You might want to run out there and you might want to write your own API wrappers from scratch. And more power to you if you do that, but you certainly don't have to. I'm going to show you 2 tools that will make the process of writing API wrappers in ColdFusion far easier. The first of them is Hyper. Hyper is by Eric Peterson, who's here, is with Ortus Solutions, and it enables you to fluently build your HTTP requests. If you read the docs where he talks about, basically his situation was the same as mine. He's written a number of API wrappers and was like, this is the same thing over and over again. I need something that abstracts away all the boilerplate, and so this is his project to do that. It's not ColdBox specific. He works for Ortus, but it is not a ColdBox specific product, so you can use it in your ColdFusion apps. That's one way to more quickly put together your API wrappers. And what we're going to be dealing with a bit more today is a project that I put together when I was actually working on this presentation for the first time. Basically what I found myself doing was I had that Mailgun API wrapper, and then I wanted to write another one, so I copied and pasted the folder, and then I started doing a bunch of finds in places, and that's just not a very efficient way to write your API wrappers. So I put this project there where I fill in some information, and it pulls over all of that boilerplate code and fills in the basic info, so it gets you started, does 90% of the work when I'm putting together an API wrapper. Now I'm going to ask a question that I don't think I want the answer to, but how many of you are familiar with command box? Okay, for those of you who aren't, I highly encourage you to check it out. Again, the people at Ortus Solutions make it, and it gives you the ability to spin up a ColdFusion server on demand on your machine. It's really easy to use, Windows, Mac, Linux, and it also, you can, like this tool I built hooks into command box, so you can use this on your machine. It's really powerful. Honestly, if you get nothing out of this talk about API wrappers, remember command box and give it a look, because it has made my life as a ColdFusion developer infinitely easier. So I'll be using this wrapper just because it speeds up the process of writing those APIs, and I'm going to show you, if you had command box, how you install that. So I'm going to terminal, and I'm going to spin up command box, and once it comes up, we're going to do And since I already have it installed, I'm just going to happen. But this gives me this wrapper tool on my machine, which I'll show you how to use for the CAD API in a minute. When you're getting started with an API, please take 5 minutes and read its documentation. It will save you tons of headaches and tons of time. I was talking to a few people who write a lot of API wrappers. John Burke was speaking with, and that was one of his tips. He said, API providers, unless you're working with an internal one, and then it's slightly different, but public API providers put a lot of work into their documentation, because really an API doesn't exist unless people are using it. So take some time, read the documentation, look at how authentication takes place, see if they have any testing endpoints, what the limitations are. Just the earlier version of the CAD API, I had started working on it, and I found out a couple hours in that it returned XML, which was a real pain because I hadn't read the docs and I was not expecting XML back. Reading the docs would have saved me a lot of trouble for that. And then one other tip. Review other client libraries. So the official clients, whether they're in PHP or Java or Node, they're going to give you a lot of insight into how the API works. If you run into issues trying to figure out how to write your ColdFusion wrapper, you can probably glean some insight from other API clients that are out there. This is, again, if you're writing a wrapper for a public API. And I'm not a Node or a PHP or a Python developer. I was an English major. But I can look at the code side by side and I can figure out what it's doing. I might not be able to write it myself, but I had a slide for this presentation that just, I couldn't get it to work on the screen. With PHP and ColdFusion side by side from one of these wrappers, and it was virtually identical. So you can take a look at other client libraries, and often they can help you figure out issues that you might encounter. All right, the CAD API wrapper. If we're using the command box module to spin it up, these are the basic questions that I end up filling in when I'm making a new API wrapper. So I'll enter the name of the API, the endpoint where that's that constant that those calls are going to be made against, the type of authentication that it is, because the module will just make some slight adjustments based on that, the doc URL, which will go into a README, but also if you're working on an API, you're going to find yourself going back to the doc URL for the API all the time, so it's worth putting that in there, a name that you have for the wrapper, description, author. This last one, package, is an option to add a box.json file. Basically what this does is it makes it so that you can share it on ForgeBox so that other developers can use it. Basically, the requirements for a package being put on ForgeBox is that you have a ColdFusion component and a box.json file which describes what your component does. It's very simple. I have a blog post here at the bottom about the first time that I put one together, the first time I put anything on ForgeBox and shared it. Kind of documenting that process. But I really encourage you, if you're writing these, if you're working on a wrapper, share it with the community. It makes all of our lives easier. Put it out there so that other people don't need to reinvent the wheel. I usually use that. I say yes to that option, but you don't have to. We'll put the file there, and you can do it all without sharing it on ForgeBox. So I'm going to use for this first one, I'll actually go through spinning up a wrapper for the CAD API. So we'll hop into the terminal and command box. And we're going to say API wrapper, scaffold, and it has a little wizard. Can't spell wizard, that'll walk us through this. So, and the name of the API is the CAD API. The endpoint URL, which I should have, that's the endpoint. It has the key authentication, done. Saved here. Enter a name, we'll call it cfCAD. A description. There's our description. Add in, I'm the author, I want a box.json. Alright, and done. It's spun up our wrapper. Now in the directory here, we have this CAD API wrapper project that we can open up and take a look at. And rather than looking at it in code here, I took a screenshot so it's larger so we can see it. This is what that little command line tool, that little API wrapper tool put together. This is the structure that I generally use when I'm writing an API wrapper. So I have a top level folder, and I wouldn't put that in version control. It basically has an index.cfm and a server.json. That server.json is there. That tells, I can use that to tell command box to spin up an Adobe 2018 server in this directory. And so I can use that index.cfm to test the calls that I'm making to the API. It makes it really easy to get up and running and started. All of my working with this API will happen within that cat API wrapper folder. Spin up a ColdFusion server right there. The real project itself is in that cfcat folder. I said I wanted to launch JSON so that I could share it, but if that option was off, that wouldn't be there. There's a license in there, a README, so that you can document the wrapper. Document the wrapper even if you're not going to share it, because honestly, you are a different developer than you are going to be in 6 months and in a year. And if you come back to this project, you're not going to remember everything that was in your mind when you started with it. So it makes sense to document it, even if you're not going to share it, because it'll, your future self will thank you. And then our real project here, the real wrapper itself, is that cat API.cfc. So let's hop in and see what things are going to start looking like inside it. The way that I like to structure my methods within an API wrapper is I have this function that's going to be mapped to endpoints, or whatever the method name is. It takes its parameters, and then all of my functions I delegate to one root API call method. That root method is going to handle all of the work that CFHTTP was handling in that manual request. So it takes the parameters, it assembles them. It takes the body and serializes the JSON. It passes in the headers for the authentication. Everything is done by that API call method. What I like about this structure too is that this method, path, params, body, header structure is very similar to the way that public API documentation is laid out. That's usually how you'll see the docs, what method is going to what endpoint and what arguments can go into it. Now this might seem a little bit abstract, so we'll look at a real method from the cat API. We were going to do a search function. So we add a method to search the API. It takes a struct of data because there's a handful of options that we can pass in there. And the way I structure it is I say to this root API call method, I want to make a get. It already knows the base URL because that's a constant for this project. I want to make the get to images/search, and I want you to pass along this struct of data as query params. And then the response, it just passes that response back to me. Now that method was called search, that function was called search. So just a note about naming your methods. You want to make sure that there's some method, unintended, to your madness. The reason I call it search is because I'm modeling the API documentation. They call it endpoint search, so I'm calling that method search. Search kind of falls outside of the normal create, retrieve, update, delete CRUD structure, but generally the CRUD pattern is very helpful for naming your methods. Also, another reason to look to official clients, if you're working with a public API that has a client and they named their method some way, it makes sense for you to just copy that. I think far too much about naming methods. I'm a little obsessive about it, so anything that I can do, any patterns that I can have that save me from trying to think about it, I try to do. So when I'm naming them according to the CRUD pattern, if it's a create request, so create's going to be a post, I'll name it create item, create resource, create user. For gets, if I'm passing in an ID, I'll do get item. That's how I name every one of those methods. If I'm doing a get, but multiple things are coming back, so like an array is coming back, I'll call it list resources, list items. Updates, when an ID is passed in, update item, delete, follows the same convention. You don't need to do these exact things. Maybe you want to call yours add item, or make new item, or whatever you want to do. Bottom line is, you want to be consistent with your naming conventions. For your own sake, and especially if you're going to share it, consistent pattern in naming makes the wrapper far easier to use. When there's a couple resources in the API, using the cat example, there's cats and breeds. I know that when they're coming back, I'm going to call everyone list resource name. Just makes it easier, less mental work when I'm working with the API. All right, we have a cat API, so I'm going to show you guys. I'm just going to spin this up. The cat project is already on ForgeBox, so right in here, let's see, down here, I'm going to spin up a ColdFusion server using command line, so just say server start. And it's going to run this code. It's going to make the cat API, and then it's going to run the command to get the random GIF, return the data from that request, and there we go. We have our cat GIF, and got to refresh a few times if we're doing it. If we're doing demos with the cat API, Okay, enough cats. That picture was there in case the live demo didn't work. We took the cat picture, and that's what we showed when we made that call to the API. But remember, HTTP responses, they're more than just data. So it wasn't just the data with the cat image that came back. There were a bunch of headers, there was a status code, and there was status tags. So if you're writing an API wrapper, I recommend that you return all that information to yourself, to the developer who's going to use your wrapper. In the case of the cat API, these headers coming back aren't terribly important, but in a lot of APIs, that information is helpful. The status code and the status text information is helpful as well. If you're working with the wrapper and you check the status code and it comes back to 400, you can handle that error response from the API gracefully. So don't just return the CFHTTP file content. Don't just return that data. You want to return your users the full HTTP response so that they can work with that and make decisions based on that. Another note when you're writing wrappers is you want to make your process of writing the wrappers, you want to make debugging that easy. Depending on the version of ColdFusion that you're on. The way ColdFusion handles serializing and deserializing JSON can be problematic. So if you're sending JSON to a server, sometimes it might not turn out exactly the way that you want it to. Or even aside from ColdFusion problems, if you're working with a complex API that has structs and arrays and stuff that are all nested with the body that you're sending to it, it can be hard to figure out whether you've actually assembled that data that you're sending to the API correctly. You might be trying to send it, you think you've got it right, but the API keeps telling you that there's something that's malformed, you can't figure out why. So there's two ways that when I spin up my wrappers in the template that I'm using, there's two ways that I do that. One is that I enable you to change the base URL. I thought you said the base URL is a constant. It is. But you can change it to help debug your API. So you can spin up the cat API wrapper, and there's services out there. I linked to a couple down here. One of them is bScepter. And what they do is they give you an endpoint. I'll just go there and show you. bScepter down. All right. So much for bScepter. Well, you're not going to be testing on that one. There's a few services out there that you can post data to, and they will show you all of the data from the HTTP request. So if you're posting JSON and you can't figure out why it isn't formatted properly, looking at the data that they're getting, it's like you're seeing your calls from the API provider's perspective. So swapping that out can be helpful. What I also do is I have an include raw option. What this does is it returns a raw key that shows you the elements that made up your request. So rather than explaining that, I will show you because the picture is worth 1,000 words. We'll copy this and we'll use this with the cat API. So what we're doing here, we're spinning up the cat API and we're saying include raw is true. And then we have some search data. We have some search data that we're passing in here. That are qualifications for the search. And I'm going to dump the full response. So it's going to have the headers, but it's also going to have that raw key that's going to show me the data that was passed in. So I don't remember. Yeah, this is the right one. All right. collapse the data because we don't care about the data. We know that we got these headers back from the API, we don't care about them either. This is that raw key. So it's showing me what I made in my request. So it's saying you did a get. This is the query param as it was put together. This is the endpoint that you posted it to, and this is the raw response that we got from the server. Providing yourself with this information, having this information available in the response, makes it very easy, or far more easy, to debug strange issues when you're posting to an API and it's returning an error and you can't figure out what you're doing wrong. So, making your own life easier, I advise you to just make sure that make debugging easy by including that in your wrapper while you're working on it. While we're working with APIs, obviously we need to deal with authentication. Some APIs have no authentication. The number that have no authentication is rapidly dropping, so it's not something generally you have to deal with. For basic auth, we remember from our REST 101 course that it's a username and password that are base 64 encoded and included in an authorization header. I'm using API key authentication here as a kind of catch-all. Basically, API providers give you a key or some combination of keys and they ask for it back. Usually that's in the header. Less commonly now, they'll ask for it as a query parameter in the body. They may ask you to pass it in as basic auth. But there's a range of ways that providers will implement API key authentication. And finally, there's Auth. How do we deal with these as ColdFusion developers? Well, we don't need to deal with no authentication. For basic auth, it's very easy. CFHTTP gives us the username and password options, and it handles that base64 encoding and the passing of that header for us. So if you're working with an API and they want basic authentication, CFHTTP's username and password options will handle that. If you're working with an API that has API key authentication, CFHTTP param, you can pass the headers that they're asking for. If it's a query param or in the body, that's pretty straightforward for providing that information. If you're working with an API that involves Auth, so Auth is if there's three parties involved. There's you, there's the API provider, and there's a user. And the user is granting your wrapper access to the API on their behalf. I'd recommend Matt Gifford's OAuth project. He's worked with OAuth for a number of different providers and knows more about that subject than I do. It's a little bit beyond the scope of this presentation. Usually what it involves just is a token is granted and that token is passed as a header in the request. Okay, if we're writing an API wrapper, especially if we're going to share it, but even if we're using it internally, we want to make it so that the credentials, those API keys or the username and password, that they don't need to be hard-coded into our application. There's a movement to separate our config from our code. It's best practices to do that. And the way that we get around that, the way that we enable users to not have to hard-code credentials is by writing our wrappers so that they can accept environment variables. Fortunately, this is pretty straightforward in ColdFusion. If you drop into Java, you create an object, the Java system object. This gives you access to environment variables and to Java system properties. So if there's a system property or an environment variable you're looking for, you just do system get env. And if that's set, you'll have that as a value. And you also have the ability to create an array of the objects, so you can get all of the environment variables or all the system properties and look to see if the key that you're looking for is there. And this way, if we use this method, we can look for environment variables for credentials rather than forcing users to hard code those and pass them in manually. In the template that we spin up, if you look at any of those examples or if you use the template, this is how I do it. It happens in the init method, and I have a little struct there that says, look for the Aylien application ID environment variable, and set it so that that doesn't need to be passed in. And I say, look for the Aylien application key environment variable, and I set that as present. If those environment variables are there, this method, using the Java system object, I can grab those environment variables and use them in the API. So, based on that last example, you can tell the next API we're looking at is the Aylien text analysis API. This was one that I stumbled across when I was just reading through that long list of API wrappers. They do natural language processing, some really cool stuff extracting data from bodies of text or from URLs. It's a little bit more complex and a little bit more real world than the CAT API, because it is frustrating when demos use only silly things and nothing that would remotely connect to the real world. So one of the reasons why we're using this one. Step one, we're going to read the docs. They give us their endpoint, Aylien, api.aylien.com. They tell us that for their authentication, they want 2 headers passed, the Aylien text API application key and application ID. And then a note here, down here, they're saying most endpoints in their API support get and post, but if you're dealing with long documents, please consider using post. So what I did was I looked at their official API clients, and all of their official API clients only use post. So I looked at their official clients, and I just copied that. I only used post when I was working on a wrapper for this API. Why would I use get if your official clients don't use get? So let's start working with this API. If we were going to spin it up with that scaffolding tool, it would look something like this. But we don't need to walk you through that because I already showed you how that works, and this API this wrapper is already also on ForgeBox. After it gets spun up, if you tell the command box module, the scaffolding module, that it's going to be API authentication, it assumes that in your init you want an API key. And this is one of those instances where, yes, every API is actually different. They don't want an API key, they want an application ID, and application key. So we update the init method with that. When I'm writing a wrapper, I have this method that I put in there, get base HTTP headers. And the purpose of this method is it provides the headers that are sent to the API provider on every request. So it's a little struct, and it's like, these are constants on every single request. I want you to send these in my CF HTTP requests. For API key authentication, it guesses that this is how you want it, but every provider is different, so we're going to update it for Aylien and say, on every request, I want you to pass these additional headers for authentication. Sets them one time, and then you don't need to worry about that with the rest of your requests. One additional note here, you see I have this user agent header that I'm passing. As I was working on this, I found out that there's an RFC spec, an official RFC spec for user agents that says user agents should be included in HTTP requests. They have an official format. It's the application and then the version of the application, and then you can put comments after that, which was news to me. I had never heard of that before. And then I went and I looked at some official clients, like for Stripe and for Mailgun, and sure enough, every one of them is providing a user agent for that API wrapper. So to follow best practices in the RFC spec, I always include the user agent, even though practically speaking, it doesn't make a difference. Just trying to do it the right way. To start working with Aylien's API, we'll just use an example here. They have an entities endpoint. So their entities endpoint extracts people, places, all sorts of data from a body of text. It's very cool. So we'll demo it on this URL. It's just a random Ars Technical article about Google. And so this is what it would look like. This is what it will look like. Because I'm going to, first of all, turn off this cat page again. In Aylien, we're going to run stuff there. So what we're doing here is we're creating the Aylien API wrapper. I already have those credentials as environment variables, and spins up. It's too fast for me. It makes the call to Aylien. I have a .entities method. Let's take a look at that method before we look at the result. Here is the entities method that we wrote. So the reason it's named entities is their official client calls it entities, so I just copied that. Like in the docs, they ask for text or a URL. It has a language. What we do is we put together the various params. So we have the language param. If text is there, we set it. If the URL is there, we set it, and then we post to the entities endpoint with the params that we put together. So we just posted in this CF Summit link, which was the Ars article, and our result is not that one. Here is our, these are the entities that it extracted from that article. So it found a number of dates in the article, a variety of keywords in the article, a specific location, various organizations, people, a URL, and then this is the full text of the article that it extracted from that URL. It's very cool, powerful functionality. I just sent it a URL, it figured out where the text was, and it pulled all these entities out of it. I don't know what your use case is for that, but you can get creative and come up with some pretty neat stuff. So, yes, we made that call, we got our result, the authentication worked. Now, Aylien is one of those APIs that actually does give you important information in their response. In their headers, they send back their rate limiting, so they send back where you're at, how many requests you have remaining, and when it's going to reset. So as a developer, that's important information for me. Just another reason why you don't want to ignore returning headers when you're writing a wrapper. This can be helpful. Now for me, I'm on the free tier, so I'm never going to hit 1,000 requests. I don't even know what the limit is for it, whether it's monthly or weekly, but the bottom line here is returning those headers is important when you're working with an API, especially a more advanced API. Now, I showed you that entities method in the component. When I look at this, my first thought is, oh, gross, that data needs to be validated. I mean, what if the language field that comes in is invalid? What if we have text there and we have URL? What if neither of them is provided, or what if both of them are provided? Like, what if the data here is not valid? Shouldn't we be doing something to make sure that the data we're working with is okay? And if you're writing an API wrapper, my opinion is the answer is no. You're writing a wrapper for the API. The API itself is what should be doing the validation of the data. Most of them do. So don't reinvent the wheel. Don't do that validation that they're already doing. Take the user's data, pass it to the API, and give them the API's response. So if we're working with Ayliens, and we pass in something, we say, well, we have a URL, but it's not actually a URL. Aylien very helpfully sends back a 400 status code and presents an error with an error message. There's no reason for us to validate that URL because that work's already being done by the API. So don't do work that you need to do. I'd say in the vast majority of cases, there's not a lot of validation that you need to do when you're writing a wrapper. You take that information from the developer, you send it to the API, whatever the API says back, you just send back to the developer. You're wrapping that functionality. And that saves you work, not having to worry about that validation. Another thing to remember is that your users are developers, which is really nice. It's nice writing for fellow developers, even if that fellow developer is yourself and you're going to be using the wrapper. So one of the things when we're writing wrapper that we want to do is identify pain points where we can make other developers or our own lives easier. Pain point is one of those things where you're working with the API and 2 or 3 times you're like, oh, that's annoying, or oh, I forgot that. And it's just like this little scratch on the back of your neck that something isn't working right and you keep forgetting it. So for me, working with Aylien's API, the issue was that I wanted to call the entities method, but I didn't want to provide the argument name. I didn't want to say text equals or URL equals. I wanted to do, like this example down here, I just wanted to say Aylien entities and pass in a URL. but it doesn't work because the URL is the second positional argument. It was a pain point while I was working. So one or the other is required, you can't provide both, so you need to name the argument you're passing in. I didn't like that, and there's a couple possible ways that you could refactor that. I'm not saying that either any of these are better, I'm just saying there are ways that you could address pain points. So one refactor you could do is rather than having text and URL, in your wrapper, you could say, it's just an input. I know that it's going to be one or the other. If it is a URL, I'll send the URL permanent. If it's not a URL, I'll send the text. And that way, the method can be called without naming the argument that's getting passed in. Like I said, maybe not the best solution, but maybe it works. Depends who your audience is. But that's one possible refactor to make developers' lives easier. Another approach would be you leave that main entities method there because it matches the official client, it matches the way the endpoint is, or it can take text or URL, but you provide additional convenience methods that delegate to that main method. So you add in entities from URL or entities from text, and all they do, you don't need to name the argument that's going into them. Entities from text will always be a text one, entities from URL will always be a URL, and they just pass it down to that main entities method, making developers' lives easier when they're using it. So that's another possible way where you can refactor a pain point when you're working with an API. One of the cool things about writing wrappers, especially non-official wrappers, is that you can kind of freestyle like this and add functionality that makes your own life easier. You don't have to just map every function one-to-one to an endpoint. You can add other things that streamline your own life. All right, moving on to the last API here. The Lob API for Printables is another one that I just stumbled across while reading a list of APIs. And this blew my mind. They send physical mail and postcards. There's an API, and you post data to that API, and they'll mail a postcard to the address that you have created, or they'll mail a letter to the postcard that you have created. There's tracking on it. I mean, it's not free, but the ability to send physical mail via an HTTP request, it just got me. That seemed otherworldly, and also like it probably has some very cool applications. If we were going to scaffold it would look something like this. Again, we don't have to, it's already up on ForgeBox, although it's really only the portions that I put together for this demo. We're going to read their documentation, which says that they do basic auth. But when we read it a little closer, they say the API key should be the username and leave the password blank. Because nothing means anything. It's not exactly what basic auth is, but that's how we're going to be doing it, because that's how they want it. Another important point when we read their documentation is that they have a test and a live endpoint, which is really common for APIs that interact with the real world. You don't want to send 1,000 postcards while you're building your API wrapper. So they give you a test endpoint that you can post to where nothing actually gets sent, but you can make sure that your calls are structured correctly. When we're writing a wrapper, obviously we want to account for that, and we probably want to use that while we're building the wrapper. If we spin it up using the module, and we say that we're going to do basic auth, it's expecting a username and a password, since that's the typical approach to basic auth. But in this case, Lob is asking for an API key, and they also have a test API key. Like I said, there's no password. And I've added an additional parameter here, force test mode equals false. So if that gets toggled to true, all of the requests will be made to their test environment, but when it's false, there'll be actual requests to the Lob API. We can take a look at how that's implemented. Since we're doing basic auth, we're going to go in there and look at the CF HTTP request. We've got username. This is how it gets spun up normally, but we're going to do it for the Lob API. So for Lob, password blank, because that's how they're doing basic auth. And for the username, I say, if force test mode is not true, we're going to put the live key in. But if it is test mode, we'll put in the test API, that test API key. And that way, that Boolean value will toggle whether these requests are made to the live or the testing environment. We could walk through this, 10 minutes left. When test mode is true, if I did create postcard, within my Lob dashboard, I would have a new postcard within their test environment. Another important thing here. So reading the Lob documentation, the Lob has an address. Lob's API has an address object. It has 12 properties, which is a lot more than any of these other APIs that we've been working with. 12 properties is a lot to account for, but it's actually not that uncommon when you're working with more complex APIs. SendGrid's mail object, I don't know if you can read this down here, but it says shows 68 more properties. It is a massive object with a lot of properties, so how we pass that into our methods gets a little bit complicated. If we're working with lobs, we could do this, which is to spell out all 12 of those properties and then check if each one is there and use that to make our HTTP call. But I think we can agree that that's going to make writing API wrappers miserable pretty fast, and it would probably be pretty difficult to use as well. So that's not the right approach, spelling out all 12 of those properties. The quickest way to address it is when there's that number of properties, just passing a struct. So there's a struct that the developers who are using your API, or you who are using your API, need to put together themselves of the various things. So for lobs, it would be, address street, city, state, zip, and they just put together that struct and they pass it in, and you pass that on to the API. Now this is fast when you're writing a wrapper because you don't really need to worry about it, but it's a bit more work for the developer who's using your API, or for you if you're the one using your API, because every time you're making a request to this method, you need to make sure that you have this struct that's properly put together, that the casing is right, that you haven't messed something up in the way that you ordered the data. This is how most official clients write their wrappers, because they're very utilitarian. So most of them don't do anything special. They just say, you're the developer, put together the data in the right way, and send it to our official wrapper. What I think is the ideal way, but it's a lot more work for you as the API wrapper author, is to create a builder function, a helper function, a helper component that builds the JSON that's going to be sent to the API. Now, again, I have a blog post that's linked down here where I walk through this in detail. Basically, what it does is I create a helpers folder. In this case, it would be address.cfc, and all of those 12 properties become properties of the component, of that helper address component. Within it, every method returns the full component. So what this does, when we return this at the end of a function, the whole component is returned. And this enables us to chain methods together. So we can say description, and then we set it, and then we do dot, the next method. That sounds abstract, I'm going to show you what it looks like. This also enables us to write more elegant fluent functions. So the address property for Lob's API, it's address_city, but no one likes typing underscores. So if someone's doing this, we can just say city, and then we'll set the address city. It makes it easier to write. So, off with the abstract, down with the concrete. If we had a helper function, this is how we can put together that gnarly 12 property address, new helpers address. And then, like I said, each one of these returns the whole object. So dot description, dot company, each one of these is a function within that address component. And as a developer, using this type of approach is way preferable. You can see exactly what's going on. It's much easier to use. The data that comes out of it is consistently produced. So it's just a much, it's a lot more work for you as the API wrapper, but it's a much nicer approach when you're working with APIs. And I can show you how that's done. Basically what I do is I loop through the properties and I serialize each one as JSON. But I don't have time to go through the specifics of that, but that's how that builder function creates the JSON that ends up getting sent to Lob as the address. Some final notes, please, if you're writing API wrappers, document them. If not for the people you're sharing with them, then at least for yourself. When you come back, like I said, your future self will thank you for writing down what you were thinking when you wrote that code. Because let's be honest, if you're looking at a code base and you're working with it for the first time, or looking at a project and working with it for the first time, don't you prefer it when it's well documented? It's so nice when how things work is actually explained. Bottom line, docs shouldn't be an afterthought. It's a lot easier to use them if you add them while you're writing your function. So you add a method, you add it to the documentation. You add a method, you add it to the documentation. Linking to the official docs helps. Down here at the bottom, there's a really helpful post about the elements of a README or the elements of documentation, what makes it helpful to users. Finally, I really encourage you, if you're going to go out there and write API wrappers, please share them with the community. Put them on GitHub, put them on ForgeBox, put them somewhere where other developers can take advantage of the hard work that you've done, so that the other people who want to work with the API don't need to reinvent the wheel. And that's it. You can find me if you have questions. I'm on GitHub, Twitter, the CFML Slack channel. I'm happy to talk here. I'll be around. Also, don't forget to use the app and to fill out the session surveys. I get that feedback from Adobe, so I really appreciate it. They appreciate it.